Okay, I'd like to call the Finance Committee meeting to order. No, we got this. Call the Finance Committee to order for March 15, 2016. And I'd like to welcome Chuck Brandon strategic analyst.
Yeah. I'd like to welcome Chuck Brannigan, City Controller, and Ron Hogan, the City Strategic Analyst Planner. And they're going to give us a pro forma view of the city's budget at this time. Thank you.
Thank you for waiting around.
So at a meeting that we had with the mayor, the council president, and Councilor Kinnan, several weeks ago, as we were talking about preparing for the upcoming budget, we had some dialogue around taking a longer-term view of the next handful of years for the city and how the budget projects, and probably for the first time in a few years, taking a more proactive approach to making sure that we're well positioned to manage not just the next year, but the next handful of years after that. So what I thought I'd do is just take a quick walk through some of the assumptions that we used in building this, and then actually take you for a walk through a view of not only 2017, again, as projected, and I do just want to make it clear that nothing that we see here should be seen as a preview of what's coming down for the budget. It's more to show what the next handful of years will look like if we go down a similar growth path to that which we've gone down the last several years, and to just try to inform folks, where that will lead us as a city. So essentially what I did was take the 2016 budget, use it as a baseline, build a projected budget for 17. In a lot of cases, we know the actual revenues and some actual expenses for 2017. So we know what our debt is, we know what our pension payment is. We have the governor's budget for local aid. So where we knew actual expenses or revenue, we used those. Where we didn't, we used growth factors that we'll go over that were based upon prior history. For major revenue categories, we assumed obviously that our property taxes are going to grow by 2.5% a year. That's pretty much a given. We continued some of the new growth that we've seen for the last few years at a brisk pace, but then made the assumption that that starts to slow down. Quite frankly, some of the building that we've seen going on isn't going to go on forever. And so some of the rates of new growth that we've seen, they're just naturally going to slow down at some point in time. We grew local receipts at 3.5%, excise tax, parking tickets, things along those lines. Maybe a little bit robust, but we were trying to look at history there. We assumed that unrestricted local aid grows at 4% a year. Chapter 70 funding formula, and I could spend probably 5 hours talking about this, but the nature of the way Chapter 70 funding works, I can pretty much tell you that for the next couple of years, we're simply going to get the minimum of $20 per student for 17, probably through 19, maybe 18, depending on how things break. After which point in time, it'll become more of a sharing model with us in the state, whereas our school budget grows, there'll be more of a 50-50 split based upon, more in line with the way that the overall funding works. And then we made the assumption that with conservative spending every year that we'd be able to add $1 million into the budget and what we call turnback. So that means that we budget revenues a little bit conservative when we overshoot them, or we budget expenses and we're able to not spend some money that gets budgeted on the expense side. So we make the assumption that every year that gets added back into the next year to help us with the next year's budget. Again, I'm not going to go through this in detail. It's there for you to take a read through at some point in time when you're bored. But really what this slide shows you is the school funding. Why? I can tell you that we're not going to be getting much more than $20 a student for the next couple of years, and it's because the target age share for the city at 54%, we're not, at 46%. This is what the state thinks we should be paying towards our school budget. We're only at 44%. So until we get to the point that, from their perspective, we're paying what we can pay towards our share, we will only get the minimum per student increase. And needless to say, there's a tremendous impact as you try to do an exercise like this, when your school budget's going up and you're only picking up the equivalent of $150,000 per year.
Can I just jump in for one quick question? So on this sheet right here, this big spreadsheet, under expenses on 5-year projection. The first one is Malden Public School budget, that 4.70. Is that reflected generally with that?
No, so, and I'll get into what this is. This just speaks to the assumptions that we made on chapter 78. Yeah, so we'll get into the expense growth in a second. So and then lastly on the school budget, what we did was we used a 4.7% growth rate. I took the last 4 years and looked at the lowest number that it's grown at in the last 4 years and made a note here. I don't know how attainable that will be, but quite frankly, it was the lowest number that I could pick to use. We're using a 3% public safety personnel number. The reality is we've grown those line items at a higher percentage rate when you factor in overtime and some of the contracts that have been settled, but I'm using the lower number. I'm using a 2.5% public works personnel growth cost. And everything else, city hall staff, OM costs, we're growing at 2%. So I think what you see, and I guess the message here is, there's nothing outlandish here, right? We haven't made any crazy assumptions in terms of what anything's growing at, right? I mean, if anything, it might be naive optimism, conservative, whatever term you want to use. So, checking. Okay, so a couple of things that we made assumptions on: snow and ice for fiscal year 17. We pretty much know where we're going to be in terms of carrying over for this fiscal year. We had a good winter, so we're reflecting that in 17, but then we're going back to a normal run rate of about $1 million a year. Charter school funding and reimbursement formula, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this in the risk areas, but we're simply growing at 2.5%. It is virtually impossible to predict because it's truly based upon student movement and government, state funding, reimbursement rates, and things that none of us can guess at. So we're going to just grow that and other assessments like the MBTA assessment, focus assessments, just at 2.5%. Grow them at the same rate that our revenue is growing at in the absence of knowing anything better to grow them at. So those are the assumptions that we used. We're going to talk about some of the risk factors that are underlying some of those assumptions. But let me jump at this point in time, and if everybody doesn't have one.
Hold it.
Yes.
I don't see health insurance.
In terms of the assumptions for health insurance, I don't know if I skip past that, but you'll see the assumption in the sheet. We assume that health insurance is growing at a 4% rate. It's identified as one of the risk categories because, quite frankly, what you'll see, I think, when the budget comes out this year is we're at a 5-grade clip. So we're using a 4% growth rate in the projection, but it's absolutely a risk that if that number turns out to be conservative,
We've had a couple good years.
Got a couple good years, and then this year it's offset by, I think, a return probably closer to reality. And, Cooking Company will tell you that they're seeing claims rates, head back up in sort of a disturbingly high growth
I
pattern.
don't want to walk down, but what was the growth rate in insurance in the last 3 years? I know it's something on, but I just want to.
Yeah, so it's a little tricky to tell you what the rate is because there was some prior positive excess experiences that had accumulated in the trust that allowed us to fund the trust at a little bit of a lower rate. So your claims growth rate was still much less than what we'd be looking at this year, but the claims growth was still probably 2 or 3% in that area.
4 was pretty realistic.
Yeah, well, I think 4 is pretty optimistic, yeah. So hopefully everybody that wants one has one of these sheets here, and we've set it on a couple of boards here for anybody else that can't see the screen all that well, so if anybody needs one, please ask. So again, what you see here is all the way to the left, 2016, the growth rate column, or the assumptions largely that I just walked through that were used in building this. As I mentioned, 2017 really is a combination of real and projections, probably more projections than real, but if I know the revenue, we use the revenue. If not, we use the assumptions we just talked about. And then, quite frankly, we carry it all the way through for the next 5 years thereafter. So if you go to 2017, actually, Chuck, do you want to go just back up to the revenue side real quick? So you see the bottom line revenue based on those assumptions, about $169 million. Not very much more than the 2016 revenue, largely driven by your property tax increases, and offset, of course, by the fact that in 2016, you can see we had almost $4 million in reserves. And for the purposes of this exercise, we're assuming that what's going to be used is only that which we can expect return backs. Because quite frankly, anything beyond that is not sustainable, right? So what this shows is $1 million coming from reserves, which is why your revenue year over year doesn't increase by all that much. Bottom line, when you take all those assumptions and go to the bottom of what 17 projects out to be using those assumptions, is a $6.7 million shortfall of expenses over revenue for 2017. Carry those assumptions right on through from 2018 to 2021. And again, I'm happy to answer questions about any individual line items. I'm not going to, drag you through each and every one of them. But what you can see is a several-year trend where not only do we start out with the deficit, but the deficit grows because the revenues just can't keep up with the growth rates, even the growth rates that we just spoke about, which I think I saw several people nodding their heads yes, that none of them were sort of, crazy unrealistic, and yet what you see is it grows, and it doesn't start going in the other direction until 2020 when finally some debt starts falling off the book. So it doesn't necessarily mean that our revenues are keeping up with our expenses, it's just being offset at that point in time with some debt that finally starts falling off the books in the 2020 year and beyond. So anybody have any questions at this point about anything in particular you want to go through or ask?
So this is independent, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is independent of the road discussion as well?
That's right. There's no, there's nothing built into here that's the assumption. It's a great question. The only thing that's in the debt schedule is that which the council has already authorized. So the borrowing for the City Hall Police Station piece, most of which has been done, but there's about $4 million left. We may or may not need to borrow all that, but that's all built into the schedule. There's no other assumptions being made, only if it's been authorized.
One more thing. Back to the 4.7 increase on, that we were talking about. How much of that is salaries and personnel costs?
So I think the school salaries grow year over year by something in the 3.2% raise when you, 3.233 when you factor in column step and baseline salary increases. So, but needless to say, the most of their budget is salaries. So
is it accurate to say that just that alone, we're not even keeping up with like the CPI or with the amount of aid we have?
Yeah, absolutely. Just that alone, I think it's a challenge to fund with the revenue sources that you have right now.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm going to just jump back for a second to some of the risk factors that I think you got to keep in mind as you see that. And then again, happy to take any questions that anybody has. But the one thing that's not in here is there's no allowance made here for any recession. So this assumes that for all those years that everything continues at the state level to be, quite frankly, pretty good. These are, from a state perspective, the good times. Capital gains taxes are coming in pretty strong. Sales taxes are coming in pretty strong. So there's nothing built into here that to account for what probably will happen in that time period. Because quite frankly, every 7 to 10 years, you're going to see a recession. You're going to see a stock market pullback. You're going to see our pension funding requirement go up. None of that's been built into here.
Councilor O'Malley, question.
Thank you very much for this presentation. You bring up a great point regarding a recession. I think that if anyone sees the stock market, we're kind of back to 2007 prices for houses. We're back at 2007 for a lot of things. This year is going to be tough. I think you bring up a great point regarding the recession. There's a really good chance this is going to repeat of 2008. We have a presidential election coming up, and we just have to be realistic in terms of where is this going. And I do see a pretty massive thing coming up ahead of us. So we do have to take that into account. We have to be realistic here. How do we handle our personal finances, our families, our community, but also the city's finances? I don't really have an answer, but this year's going to be tough.
Thank you.
We got a question. Can we just repeat it?
So we're saying we're going into this budget down 6.7 million.
So what I'm saying, Councilor, is if we go down the exact path that we've gone down, say, in prior years, and I don't mean that in any negative way, but if we just grow the line items at the rates that we've spoken of, not which are abnormal, you would have that type of shortfall, something in the $7 million range shortfall, yes.
Doesn't take into consideration the amount of money that is needed for the roads.
That's correct. That's correct.
Doesn't take into consideration any kind of revenue streams that we might come up with as a city council. For instance, resident parking, following up on collecting those excise taxes that so many people have gotten away from. Possibility of doing something at a cemetery to create a revenue stream, or the possibility of this council considering taking over parking garages as a revenue stream. Correct?
None of those are in here, but they might highlight the need for some.
Okay. So what I'm gonna ask you is, how can we balance this budget? Is it driving revenues, or are you talking cuts?
Ultimately,
It's a one-time fix.
yeah. I mean, ultimately, I imagine that'll be a byproduct of the budget discussion to figure out what the right balance between those two are. I think like most things, you find out the answer is yes, right, all of the above, because, it's grown to a level where it can't be one answer, it has to be every answer. And you're absolutely right, it's gotta be some combination of looking at perhaps revenue opportunities that we passed on previously and get thrown back out of the table, and every dollar that gets spent, because you don't get to solving that type of bottom line difference without having everything be on the table. And but I said at the beginning, Councilor, and I just wanted to, this isn't intended to be sort of a preview of what may come down. I think when Council President Murphy and Councilor Kinnon, when I showed it to them, I think they just thought it would be a good backdrop for folks to have heading into the budget dialogue to realize, where it is that we're at and lay the groundwork for some of those discussions.
Can we count on 4% from the state, or is that a high?
On the local aid side, in the absence of a recession, it's probably not completely unrealistic, but quite frankly, the unrestricted local aid, whether it goes from 4 to 6%, you're talking about whether it goes from 500,000 to 600,000, 5 to 650. I mean, that's not going to make or break for your school aid, which you're not going to get that formula changed, no matter how hard folks are trying, it's a long way. But your school aid and then your expense structure, it's no different than, your home budget. They gotta grow at a similar rate. Let me just go real quick through the last couple of assumptions. The last one's fairly important, but charter school sending tuition and reimbursements are really unknowns. I mentioned it earlier. There's a symbiotic relationship as folks leave the public schools to go to the charter school where you're gonna get some additional funding that's found money for a few years, but then eventually the student's gone, the money's gone, and if you haven't adjusted your expense base to align with that, then you're really gonna find yourself trying to catch up with that. That's all gonna be dependent upon, how many kids get lost in the public schools to the charter schools over the next few years, and that could have a significant impact, one way or the other, on your budget. We mentioned health insurance. We're looking at something in the neighborhood, and I don't think I'm letting the cat out of the bag. I think Anthony Ciccarelli had mentioned this previously, something in the neighborhood of a 9.5% increase using a 4% number. We're hoping that we find some happy middle ground between the last 3 years and this year, and that some, lands in there, but again, that's a significant risk category. It's a $20 million line item. So a 1% difference is $200,000 swing. It doesn't take much, right? You go from 4 to 8%, you're at another $800,000 in the drop of a hat. So that's a big line item. And this one here is one that, quite frankly, is near and dear to my heart. I think at some point in time, all municipalities are going to be dealing with OPEB funding. And for those that don't know, OPEB is funding other post-employment benefits, really retiree health insurance. So at some point in time, I can guarantee, I don't know if it'll be in the next couple of years or longer, but our OPEB liability is $144 million. Our pension liability is only, quotations, $86 million. At some point in time, the state is going to come up with a similar funding process and requirement that they did with the pension formulas and force municipalities to start funding that. We pay $9 million a year right now towards this $86 million liability. I don't need to do the math to tell you when that happens, the type of numbers you might be talking about to fund that type of unfunded liability. So it's lurking out there, nothing's built in here, but at some point in time, this is going to become something that impacts our budget, just like back in the mid-'80s, we went from a pay-as-you-go pension system to an actuarially funded system, and now we're, there'll be a ramp-up process, but it's going to hit at some point in time. So those are risk factors. Chuck, do you want to just talk about, Chuck can put this slide together. I think it's a good one to show you what happens during recessions with state aid. And again, it's just to warn us that it's not that it doesn't just go up, but it goes down. And, you know, at some point in time, based upon cycles, if you go back to 2003, 2004, you go back to 2008, 2009, you know, now we've had sort of a healthy increase, but if we hit one of those periods where it's heading down, the assumptions are out the window. So that's just to kind of give you a little bit of a historical view of what's happened the last couple of times that we've hit those bumps in the road from the state level. This was something Councilor Kennedy, I think, had asked for and thought would be interesting for folks to see as we sort of think about the growth of our budget and capacity going forward. It's just a CPI index for wage earners and clerical workers in the Boston area. Really kind of gives you an idea of you know, sort of what the equivalent of inflation is for folks that are working in the Boston area as we look at, try to figure out, you know, what we should be doing over the course of the next, you know, few years.
Can you stop there for a second?
Yeah.
The reason I bring this up.
The reason I bring this up to the councilors is the fact that in industry, what you've seen happen is that the average raises have gone down precipitously. And they've gone down so the average person is out there getting 1 to 1.5% as their annual type increases. Maybe 2% if you're really in a good company. Average, some people get more, some people get less. What hasn't happened on a municipal level is our contracts have stayed where they were before. We can't continue, you know, earlier Council D'Angelo asked and Mr. Hogan said that, you know, the school department increases are, you know, somewhere around 3 to 3.5% on an annual basis. That's where they've been all along, going back to 1999 and before. We didn't adjust after that recession in 2008, 2009, and the inflation rate has dropped dramatically. So when somebody gets a 2.5 to 3% increase, for instance, we're all a little bit richer today than we were a year ago because gasoline has dropped so much, and a lot of other things have dropped because of that. We've got to adjust our mindset like industry has when we negotiate contracts. Otherwise, these increases that are built in are going to continue out to the future, and we're simply going to have to cut bodies. So in the schools, they'd have to cut bodies. If you give it the increase of 3%, and you do that for the next 5 years, we will be cutting bodies. So you will have larger class sizes. Whereas if you can lower that down to the 1.5%, you know, 1.5% when you have inflation rates at this low, you could save bodies. That's all.
And then the last slide, Chuck, is just to kind of give everyone a reminder of where we stand from a reserves perspective. The number last certified by the state was the top line number, $15.9 million. I think as everybody knows, in this year's budget, there was $3.95 million used, call it $4 million out of this year's budget. And I'm showing the fact that based upon our prior dialogue, the council desired to use, I forget what it agreed to use, some of the money in reserves towards the purchase of a temporary city hall location. So what you have going into this year's budget, with a question mark as to what ends up being the right number for this year, but there's about $10 million in reserves that are out there in the city's coffers to you know, to deal with, along with some of the other things that you mentioned, Councilor Condon, to deal with trying to figure out what the right combination of factors are to address the gap that you see between revenue and expenses. So that's.
Can you flip back to this slide?
Yeah.
So keeping that in mind. If we used all six, if we used 6.7 million.
If we use $6.7 million and this plan happened, which again is very conservative from the standpoint of hoping some of these things happen on the growth side, but if it came true and we use 6.7 million of reserves to plug the gap, then indeed we'd only be left with, you know, $3 or $4 million and faced up with a worse situation. To Councilor Condon's, you know, comment, we just compound the problem and end up in a worse situation next year. So in order to create a softer landing, it does have to be a combination of things that have to start now and not later. Thank you.
Well, it's a little different than that, right? There was already
There's already $4 million I saw out of the free cash going into the next year's budget. Did I see that?
No, that's in the current fiscal year budget.
So none has been allocated for the next year's budget?
Yeah, so there's no assumption made for the FY17 budget, because again, I think that'll come out of the budget process and the dialogue debate.
So let me just say, you know, the mayor and the administration has their work cut out for them, and speaking for myself, I mean, I'm ready to do it. Some of us have been preaching this for years, that this would be coming, and unfortunately it's come. So, you know, it's the mayor's budget, but I stand ready to support him in the tough cuts that are gonna have to be made. Thank you.
Any other comments? Thank you very much. Appreciate the effort you put into it, the hard work you did. Gives us a view of how difficult the budget is. So, thank you, everybody. Hey, was there any discussion about your councils? All in favor? Aye.